In the spring of 1944, the Crimean Peninsula is more than a strip of land between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. For the Soviet leadership, it is a lost fortress that resisted for 250 days in 1941 to 1942 and then fell, with most of its garrison killed or captured and Sevastopol reduced to rubble. For Berlin and Bucharest, it has become a forward bastion guarding the approaches to the Romanian oil fields and the sea lanes of the western Black Sea. The struggle that is about to begin is shaped as much by memory and prestige as by terrain and tonnage. Sevastopol, pre-war base of the Black Sea Fleet and a heavily fortified hero city, had been the last major Soviet strongpoint in Crimea to collapse in July 1942, after a siege lasting from 30 October 1941. During the final assault, the German 11th Army deployed over 200,000 men and extensive heavy artillery, supported by Luftwaffe formations that dropped more than 20,000 tons of bombs in a month. The separate coastal army and Black Sea Fleet lost around 200,000 men killed, wounded or captured in the wider campaign. The city's pre-war population of roughly 110,000 was reduced to only a few thousand inhabitants by the time Axis occupation was fully established. Sevastopol's fall became a reference point in Soviet military and political discourse, an example of sacrifice and a humiliation to be reversed. The Axis occupation turned Crimea into a rear area for Army Group South and then Army Group A. German and Romanian units of the 17th Army garrisoned the peninsula and used its ports, airfields and roads to support operations toward the Caucasus and along the Black Sea coast. Air bases in Crimea allowed the Luftwaffe and Royal Romanian Air Force to threaten Soviet shipping and coastal targets. German planners also saw the peninsula as a platform from which Soviet aircraft could strike Ploesti should it be lost, which reinforced Hitler's later insistence on holding it at all costs. By late 1943, the wider strategic picture on the Eastern Front had changed. Soviet advances along the Dnieper and in southern Ukraine pushed Army Group South Ukraine back from the lower Dnieper and cut the land corridor to Crimea. In November 1943, the Red Army severed the connection at the Perekop Isthmus, leaving 17th Army dependent on sea supply across the Kerch Strait and from Romanian ports. Hitler nevertheless forbade evacuation, fearing both the loss of a strategically located base and the political impact of abandoning the peninsula captured at such cost in 1941 to 1942. German orders designated Crimea and Sevastopol as fortresses to be held even if encircled. On the Soviet side, the Southern Front was redesignated the Fourth Ukrainian Front in October 1943 under General Fyodor Tolbukhin. Its armies fought through right-bank Ukraine and then turned south toward the Isthmus of Perekop and the shallow lagoons of the Sivash. In parallel, the reformed separate coastal army, rebuilt after its destruction in 1942, carried out a series of amphibious landings around Kerch and Eltigan from November 1943. These operations created bridgeheads on the eastern tip of Crimea and tied down German and Romanian formations at the cost of heavy Soviet casualties and months of positional fighting. From January to early April 1944, both Soviet groupings improved fortifications, stockpiled ammunition, and trained specifically for breaching prepared defences in narrow sectors. By early April 1944, the forces facing each other on the peninsula were substantial. The 4th Ukrainian Front, with 2nd Guards Army, 51st Army, 4th Air Army and attached formations, together with the separate Coastal Army and the Black Sea Fleet, fielded about 462,400 personnel, 560 tanks and assault guns, 6,000 guns and mortars, and roughly 1,200 aircraft. Opposing them, the German 17th Army and attached Romanian Mountain Corps and other formations had between 230,000 and 255,000 men, over 1,800 guns, more than 200 tanks and assault guns, and about 150 aircraft, supported by Kriegsmarine and Romanian naval units tasked with supply and, if necessary, evacuation. Crimea's geography compressed these forces into a few critical corridors. To the north, the Perekop Isthmus offered a land approach only a few kilometers wide, reinforced by German fieldworks and older Soviet fortifications. East of it, shallow inlets of the Sivash, often called the Rotten Sea, provided a partially flooded flank where Soviet engineers had already prepared causeways and ferry routes. In the east, the Kerch Peninsula, now holding the separate coastal army's bridgehead, pointed westward toward the central Crimean plateau and the road and rail lines leading to Simferopol and Sevastopol. Any Soviet offensive would have to synchronize assaults across these separated axes under variable spring weather, while the defenders attempted to trade space for time and withdraw towards shortened lines. For Soviet commanders and political leaders, the coming operation had both operational and symbolic dimensions. Militarily, eliminating the 17th Army would disrupt German positions along the Black Sea, secure approaches to the Caucasus, and free troops for later offensives into Romania and the Balkans. Politically, retaking Sevastopol rapidly would contrast sharply with the 250 days the city had fought before its fall to the Axis. The prospect of capturing the port by May 9th, 1944, within little more than a month of the planned opening assault on April 8th, thus carried clear propaganda value, presented as an answer to earlier defeats and as one of the major blows of the 1944 campaign season. For the German command, the situation combined operational risk and political pressure. General Erwin Jannecke, commanding 17th Army, repeatedly argued that his troops, short of fuel and heavy equipment and dependent on vulnerable sea lanes, could not hold the peninsula indefinitely and should be withdrawn to save trained manpower. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, under Hitler's direct influence, rejected these proposals, ordering that Sevastopol be held as a fortress and evacuation be considered only as a last resort. Romanian leaders, whose divisions formed a significant part of the garrison, faced the dilemma of obeying German orders while fearing encirclement and destruction of their mountain and cavalry units. For civilians and minorities in Crimea, the approaching battle unfolded against the background of occupation and looming political decisions. Many Russian and Ukrainian inhabitants had lived through the 1941 to 1942 siege, Axis rule and reprisals, and now anticipated another offensive with its attendant bombardments and shortages. Crimean Tatars, already subject to close scrutiny by Soviet security organs because of alleged collaboration and complex wartime loyalties, would soon face mass deportation. On the 13th of April 1944, while the offensive was being prepared, NKVD leaders approved secret measures to cleanse the peninsula of perceived hostile elements, a plan that would be carried out in May after the fighting ended. Thus, when Tolbukhin's artillery and assault troops began to move toward Perekop and the Sivash, the operation already combined a military objective, a symbolic reversal of earlier losses, and a set of political and security aims that would shape the fate of entire communities. In the first week of April 1944, the Crimean front settles into an expectant pause. Along the Perekop Isthmus, Soviet artillery commanders finalize fire plans that have been revised repeatedly over the winter. Heavy guns and Katyusha batteries are brought forward under cover of darkness, emplaced in prepared positions that survey narrow sectors of the German main line. At the Sivash, engineer units strengthen causeways across the shallow lagoons, laying additional corduroy roads and ferry points to support a rapid build-up once the offensive begins. In the east, the separate coastal army tightens its grip on the Kerch bridgehead, rotating exhausted battalions to the rear and bringing fresh regiments into assault positions facing west. On April 6th to 7th, General Tolbukhin's headquarters issues the final operational orders. Shock groups are formed within 2nd Guards Army and 51st Army for the main blow at Perekop and across the Sivash, with attached tank brigades and self-propelled artillery intended to exploit any breach. The 4th Air Army and Black Sea Fleet Aviation received detailed tasks. Some regiments are to suppress German artillery and command posts, others to interdict roads leading south from the isthmus toward Jankoy and Simferopol. Coordination tables specify the minutes when air units must shift their attention from the front line to deeper targets, in order to sustain pressure without blocking the advance of ground forces. On the other side, 17th Army headquarters in Simferopol tracks these preparations through aerial reconnaissance and interrogations of prisoners, but its assessments remain cautious rather than alarmist. The German command expects a Soviet attack and has prepared a defense in depth around Perekop and the northern approaches, including the reactivated earthworks of the old Turkish wall and a chain of trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank ditches. Romanian formations, including mountain and infantry units, hold sectors in the interior and along secondary approaches, tasked both with defence and internal security. Jaenecke's staff assumes that the narrowness of the isthmus and the seasonal difficulties of the Sivash will impose limits on Soviet tempo. In the early hours of April 8th, Soviet forward observers confirm that their targets are in place. Communication lines between infantry, artillery, and air units are checked again. At first light, the opening barrage begins simultaneously on the Perekop sector and opposite the Sivash positions. For a set period, guns concentrate on known strong points, artillery batteries and observation posts. Then, according to prearranged schedules, the fire lifts and creeps forward in front of the assault infantry. Low-flying aircraft attack suspected reserves and crossroads behind the front, while medium bombers strike at Jankoy and other nodes that might channel German reinforcements northward. Infantry regiments from 2nd Guards Army move out behind the barrage in tightly controlled waves, sappers advancing in front to cut wire, clear minefields and mark safe lanes. Where resistance is strong, platoons halt and call down additional fire from divisional and corps artillery. Tanks and self-propelled guns follow on the most stable ground, limited by the narrow front and the state of the roads. Across the Sivash, assault groups expand the existing bridgehead, pushing against German positions that had been watching the frozen and then muddy flats through the winter. Here, movement is slower and more fragmented, with men often advancing in small groups along causeways and embankments under direct fire. For the German and Romanian defenders, the first day of the offensive brings a rapid shift from relative quiet to continuous pressure. Divisional headquarters forward of Simferopol struggle to maintain communication with frontline battalions as telephone lines are cut and radio networks overloaded. Units stationed in the first trench system report losses from the preparatory bombardment and request permission to pull back to secondary positions. Local counterattacks, mounted by infantry companies and assault gun detachments, slow Soviet probes in some sectors, but cannot restore the original alignment of the line once key strongpoints have been lost. Jaenecke and his staff, informed by situation reports and liaison officers, face early decisions. The original directive from higher command is to hold the Perekop defences as long as possible to gain time for a subsequent withdrawal toward the Sevastopol sector, where a shortened perimeter might be defended longer and supplied by sea. However, the intensity of Soviet fire and the scale of the assault raise doubts about whether the front line can withstand more than a few days of continuous pressure. Requests for additional Luftwaffe support are sent, but air units based in Crimea and southern Ukraine are limited by fuel shortages, aircraft serviceability, and competing demands along the Black Sea coast. For the Soviet command, reports from the first day indicate both progress and obstacles. Some divisions penetrate the forward German positions faster than expected, while others encounter stubborn resistance and uncut minefields that delay their schedule. Tolbukhin's staff begins to adjust the plan, shifting artillery concentrations and committing additional units to sectors where a breakthrough seems most likely. Logistical officers monitor ammunition expenditure and the flow of supplies across the Sivash and along the narrow roads leading to Perikop. Aware that maintaining momentum in the first days is essential if the operation is to achieve a rapid collapse of the 17th Army, rather than a prolonged positional battle. Civilian experience in northern Crimea reflects this escalation. Villages near the front are subjected to artillery fire from both sides, as German batteries respond to Soviet barrages and use inhabited areas for camouflage and observation. Some inhabitants attempt to move south toward larger towns, joining military traffic on already congested roads, while others seek shelter in cellars and improvised dugouts, uncertain whether the new offensive will pass quickly or develop into a siege reminiscent of earlier battles. In Sevastopol itself, news of the offensive arrives only as fragments of rumour and official communiqué, but the memory of 1941 to 1942 shapes expectations. Many assume that if the front north of the city is broken, events could move faster than in the earlier siege, when the attackers themselves needed months to bring up heavy artillery and supplies. In the months before the April assault, the Soviet leadership defines Crimea as both an operational task and an opportunity to demonstrate a new tempo of warfare. Stavka directives framed the 4th Ukrainian Front and separate coastal army not just as forces to recapture the peninsula, but as instruments to show that a position taken by the Axis after a 250-day siege can be retaken in a matter of weeks. In planning conferences in late 1943 and early 1944, Tolbukhin and the commanders of 2nd Guards Army, 51st Army and the Coastal Army review earlier Crimean operations, including the costly Kerch-Feodosia landings of 1941 to 1942, and place particular emphasis on avoiding piecemeal attacks against prepared positions without sufficient artillery and air preparation. The operational concept for the new offensive rests on converging blows. The main effort is assigned to the 4th Ukrainian Front. 2nd Guards Army is to force the Perikop Isthmus frontally, while 51st Army expands and exploits the Sivash bridgehead, turning German positions from the east. Once a breach is achieved, mobile groups built around tank and mechanized brigades will push rapidly toward Jankoy, then diverge towards Simferopol and the western coast, aiming to split the 17th Army and prevent an orderly withdrawal. The separate coastal army's task is to break out from the Kerch bridgehead and advance through the central plateau, coordinating with Tolbukhin's forces to encircle German and Romanian units in successive pockets. Logistics and firepower are treated as decisive variables. Soviet staff officers calculate daily ammunition expenditure for artillery and mortars, tonnage of fuel required for mechanized units, and the throughput capacity of the limited road and rail network leading into northern Crimea. Special attention is paid to the Sivash crossings. Engineer brigades prepare additional causeways capable of carrying medium tanks and self-propelled guns, aware that spring weather could turn much of the surrounding terrain into impassable mud. The Black Sea Fleet is tasked with protecting coastal flanks, delivering supplies to ports captured during the advance, and maintaining pressure on Axis shipping lanes that might be used for evacuation. Intelligence estimates inform these preparations. Reconnaissance flights, partisan reports and interrogation of prisoners suggest that 17th Army includes multiple German infantry divisions, Romanian mountain and infantry formations, and fortress units concentrated around Sevastopol. Soviet planners judge that, although the Axis retains fortified positions and experienced troops, the loss of the land connection and dependence on sea supply reduce its capacity to maneuver and to replace losses. Assessments of Axis air strength indicate that the Luftwaffe presence over Crimea has declined since 1942, though planning documents still warn of possible, concentrated air attacks on Soviet bridgeheads and pontoon crossings. On the German side, planning is constrained by directives from higher command. The 17th Army's own staff analyses, circulated in late 1943 and early 1944, argue for a phased evacuation to conserve manpower and equipment, pointing to the loss of the land corridor and the vulnerability of supply convoys in the Black Sea. These proposals are rejected. Orders from Hitler, transmitted via Army Group South Ukraine, define Crimea as a fortress region to be held. Sevastopol is singled out as a symbol that must not be surrendered, both for domestic propaganda and for its perceived strategic value as a base threatening Soviet communications and shielding the Western Black Sea. Within that framework, operational planning focuses on delaying actions and the hope of a stabilized line. Divisions are deployed in depth north of Sevastopol, with the expectation that, if Perekop and the Sivash positions can be held for a time, the Soviet offensive might lose momentum, allowing a planned withdrawal to prepared positions closer to the fortress. Naval and air staffs calculate the capacity of ports and shipping to bring in ammunition and evacuate wounded, but large-scale extraction of combat units is not formally embraced as a primary objective. Romanian commanders, aware of their forces' exposure on the peninsula and concerned about political repercussions at home, participate in these discussions but have limited influence over the final decisions. These opposing plans reveal contrasting assessments of time. Soviet documents repeatedly stress the need for speed, with target dates for reaching Jankoy, Simferopol, and the Sevastopol approaches laid out in operational graphics. The idea that Sevastopol could fall around early May, roughly 2 years after its loss in July 1942, is not presented as an exact deadline, but as an attainable marker of the Red Army's change capabilities. German planning, by contrast, treats time as a margin to be stretched. Each day that the northern defences hold is intended to make possible either a more orderly retreat to the Sevastopol perimeter or the maintenance of a garrison sufficient to tie down Soviet forces for an extended period. When the offensive opens on April 8th, these plans begin to interact with the realities of terrain, weather, and morale. The Soviet design aims to compress what had once been a long attritional process into a rapid sequence of breakthroughs and encirclements. The German and Romanian concept seeks to trade ground for time and preserve combat power under political orders that limit options. The next days on the Perekop Isthmus and along the Sivash will show how far either side can translate its planning assumptions into control over the tempo of events. On April 8th, after the initial artillery preparation, the front along Perekop and the Sivash settles into a pattern of continuous assault and counterfire. Soviet infantry from the 2nd Guards Army press against the first trench lines on the narrow isthmus, advancing behind a moving barrage that shifts in short bounds. Observation posts report sections of the old Turkish wall torn open by direct hits from heavy guns, while other sectors remain intact, forcing assault groups to seek gaps under small arms and machine gun fire. The fighting concentrates around strong points that control roads and drainage canals, turning individual farmsteads and bunkers into local centers of resistance. By midday, several Soviet rifle divisions have forced shallow penetrations into the forward German positions. Engineers clear paths through minefields and mark them with stakes and flags, allowing tanks and self-propelled guns to move up in single file along the safest ground. The defenders attempt to seal these breaches with company-sized counterattacks supported by assault guns and mortars. In some places, German and Romanian infantry succeed in pushing the attackers back to their start lines. In others, they are compelled to fall back to secondary trenches when flanking fire from neighbouring Soviet units makes their positions untenable. Across the Sivash, the 51st Army's bridgehead becomes a separate but linked arena. Here, the terrain of shallow lagoons, mudflats, and low islands breaks the front into segments. Soviet infantry use previously prepared causeways and improvised pontoons to expand the bridgehead, aiming to seize higher ground on the Crimean shore. German units, deployed along the embankments and small rises, bring down concentrated fire on crossing points. Losses in the first waves are significant, but once a number of Soviet battalions secure footholds beyond the immediate shoreline, they begin to dig in and bring forward light artillery and mortars to support further advances inland. For the defenders, These early engagements reveal the scale of the offensive. Reports from frontline battalions speak of dense artillery fire, coordinated infantry movement, and frequent use of smoke to cover advances and mine clearing. Divisional command posts receive overlapping calls for reinforcement, while their reserves are limited, and the road network behind the front is already congested with supply columns and medical evacuation vehicles. German staff officers note that Soviet artillery appears to be concentrating methodically on command posts and communications hubs, complicating efforts to maintain coherent control over the line. On April 9th, the pattern repeats with important variations. At Perekop, Soviet commanders adjust their axes of advance based on the first day's results. Artillery is retargeted to those strong points that held out longest, and fresh regiments are committed to sectors where the forward trenches have already been disrupted. In the Sivash sector, additional engineer units strengthen the crossing infrastructure, allowing a higher rate of movement for men and equipment. The cumulative effect is a deepening of Soviet footholds. Instead of clinging to narrow salients, assault units start to link their gains and occupy parts of the German First Defensive Zone in depth. In response, 17th Army orders local withdrawals to pre-planned secondary positions. The aim is to avoid encirclement of forward companies and to trade space for time according to earlier defensive concepts. However, in the restricted terrain of the isthmus and the swampy banks of the Sivash, these movements sometimes occur under direct observation. Soviet artillery and aircraft target retreating columns on roads and causeways, increasing material and personnel losses. The need to execute these withdrawals under fire places additional strain on morale, particularly among Romanian units that are aware of the broader setbacks on the Eastern Front. Civilian populations in the northern Crimean settlements experience the first direct impact of the operation. Some villages near the defensive lines are evacuated by German authorities, with inhabitants ordered to move south or to work on fortifications. Others remain in place and find themselves between the opposing forces as artillery shells land in streets and fields. Soviet leaflets are dropped over the front and rear areas, calling on soldiers to surrender and civilians to wait for liberation, while German and Romanian commanders tighten security measures to prevent desertion and maintain order in rear zones. By the end of 9 April, the Soviet command can identify emerging local successes. On certain sectors of the Perekop line, assault units report that they have reached the second trench system or captured key junctions in the defensive network. In the Sivash bridgehead, battalions are now holding positions several kilometers from the original shoreline, threatening to outflank parts of the isthmus defences by advancing toward the rear of German formations. Tolbukhin's headquarters begins to plan the commitment of mobile groups, still held back, to exploit any wider breach that might open in the coming days. For 17th Army, the situation remains serious but not yet catastrophic. Janicki and his staff believe that if they can stabilize a new line south of the initial defenses and delay the Soviet advance for a limited period, they may still be able to execute a staged withdrawal toward the central Crimean plateau and the outer approaches to Sevastopol. Requests are sent for reinforcements and additional air support, but these have to be balanced against demands from other sectors of Army Group South Ukraine. The first engagements have shown that the Soviet side is willing and able to maintain a high operational tempo. The question now is whether the defenders can impose delays sufficient to preserve their forces for later phases of the campaign. On April 10th, the operation moves from local penetrations to a broader crisis along the northern Crimean front. After a short night of regrouping, Soviet artillery resumes concentrated fire, this time directed not only at the immediate front line, but also at junctions between divisions and suspected reserve assembly areas. Air units increase sorties against road intersections and bridges leading south toward Jankoy. The aim is to prevent the defenders from reconstituting a continuous line and to open gaps that can be exploited by mobile formations waiting in depth. At Perekop, rifle divisions of the 2nd Guards Army report that sections of the primary defensive belt have been overrun. In some places, Soviet troops now occupy parts of the Turkish wall and adjacent trench systems, using captured dugouts as cover against counterfire. Sappers work to widen cleared lanes through minefields so that more tanks and self-propelled guns can pass simultaneously, reducing the vulnerability of long columns. Attempts by German and Romanian units to counterattack with battalion-sized groups encounter prepared anti-tank fire and pre-registered artillery, leading to further attrition among already stretched reserves. On the Sivas flank, 51st Army's progress exerts growing pressure. By this stage, the bridgehead has expanded sufficiently to allow the deployment of additional artillery and a limited number of armoured vehicles on the Crimean shore. Soviet infantry push inland toward road links that run behind the Perekop sector, threatening to roll up parts of the line from the east. For the defenders, this creates an immediate operational dilemma. Holding forward positions risks encirclement, but withdrawing without preparation under observation exposes columns to concentrated artillery and air attack. Within the 17th Army headquarters, reports from both sectors outline a deteriorating situation. Jaenecke and his staff attempt to implement previously drafted contingency plans for a phased retreat to positions closer to the central steppe. However, authorization for larger movements remains conditioned by orders from higher command that emphasize holding ground as long as possible. Communications with some divisional headquarters are intermittent, forcing the Army staff to rely on partial information and delayed updates when making decisions about the timing and direction of withdrawals. As Soviet units widen their footholds, mobile groups begin to move. Tank and mechanized brigades are fed through the most successful breach sectors, aiming to drive rapidly toward Jankoy, the key rail and road junction linking northern Crimea to the interior. Their advance is slowed by damaged infrastructure, minefields, and the need to share narrow routes with artillery and supply traffic, yet they still begin to appear in areas that German planning documents had expected to remain in rearward depth for several more days. Luftwaffe aircraft launch ground attack sorties against these spearheads, but limited numbers and fuel constraints restrict their ability to sustain pressure. By 11 April, the cumulative effects of these movements become visible in the operational picture. Soviet reports indicate that elements of their forward units are nearing the outskirts of Jankoy, and that German formations are pulling back from parts of the Perekop sector in disorder rather than in the controlled fashion envisaged in earlier defensive plans. Some rear area depots and staging points are abandoned hurriedly, with equipment destroyed or left behind when transport cannot be organized in time. Romanian units covering flanks or secondary lines find themselves under threat of isolation and request clarification of their orders in case further withdrawal becomes unavoidable. Civilian traffic mixes with military columns on the main roads. Administrative officers and families associated with German and Romanian garrisons begin relocating from smaller northern settlements toward larger towns and, ultimately, Sevastopol, where shipping offers a potential route off the peninsula. Local inhabitants face different choices. Some seek to leave areas close to the fighting, while others remain, aware that rapid front movement can make displacement risky. Economic activity, already constrained by years of war and occupation, contracts further as rail services are disrupted and stocks of fuel and food are redirected to military use. In Soviet front and army newspapers, the speed of the advance is noted explicitly. Commentaries draw contrasts between the lengthy siege operations of 1941 to 1942 and the current timetable, emphasizing that positions once taken over months of heavy bombardment are now being approached from the land side in a matter of days. This comparison is used to underline claimed improvements in coordination between infantry, artillery, and armour, as well as the increased ability of the Red Army to conduct deep operations across multiple axes such as Perekop, the Sivas, and the Kerch bridgehead. By the evening of April 11th, both sides recognise that the northern defensive system has been compromised beyond repair. For the Soviet command, the focus turns to preventing the 17th Army from re-establishing a coherent line deeper inside Crimea and to accelerating the push towards Simferopol and the approaches to Sevastopol. For Jaeneke and his subordinates, the priority shifts from holding specific positions to conducting a fighting withdrawal that preserves as many formations as possible for the defense of the Sevastopol perimeter or for eventual evacuation. Control over the tempo of operations, which German planners had hoped to use to their advantage, is now increasingly determined by the rate of Soviet advance and the ability of their own units to disengage under pressure. By 12th April, the pattern of local breakthroughs and contested withdrawals along Perekop and the Sivash turns into a deep operational rupture. Forward detachments of the 2nd Guards Army and the 51st Army report that German and Romanian units are no longer holding in continuous lines, but are retreating in segments toward the interior of the peninsula. Reconnaissance indicates that positions identified in earlier plans as secondary defensive zones are being occupied hastily without the full complement of obstacles and fire plans that staff studies had envisaged. Jankoi, the key junction that links the northern approaches with rail and road routes to Simferopol and Sevastopol, becomes the central objective for Soviet mobile groups. Tank and mechanized brigades now operate ahead of the main rifle formations wherever terrain and supply allow. Their tasks are to seize crossings, disrupt retreating columns, and prevent the formation of new defensive fronts. Commanders balance the imperative of speed against the need to avoid outrunning artillery and logistics. Fuel trucks and ammunition convoys move close behind armoured spearheads, exploiting the road network that the retreating 17th Army had hoped to use for its own redeployment. Where roads are cratered or bridges destroyed, engineers work under fire to create bypasses, knowing that delays measured in hours can affect the ability to reach Sevastopol before the defenders consolidate. Within 17th Army headquarters, the decision is taken to concentrate remaining forces toward the central axis leading to Sevastopol, while holding covering positions where possible in the steppe. Jaeneke's staff issues orders for a general withdrawal southward, but the timing and routes vary by sector, depending on unit cohesion and the availability of transport. Some formations manage to disengage in relatively good order, leaving rearguards to delay Soviet advance with prepared ambushes and demolition of infrastructure. Others are forced into hasty marches under pressure, fragmenting as stragglers, support troops, and mixed German-Romanian groups fall behind the main body. The air and artillery situation amplifies the effects of these movements. Soviet aircraft focus increasingly on road traffic, attacking columns of vehicles, horse-drawn wagons, and marching troops whenever weather permits. Artillery units, redeployed from the Perekop and Sivash sectors, extend their range southward as soon as new firing positions are occupied. For the retreating Axis formations, this creates zones of heightened vulnerability at choke points such as bridges, village crossings, and road junctions. Units tasked with rear security must choose between defending these points to preserve evacuation routes and destroying them to delay the pursuers, a choice that affects both military withdrawal and civilian movement. In Simferopol and other central Crimean towns, the concentration of troops and administrative bodies reaches its peak in these days. Staff officers move repeatedly. Hospitals receive streams of wounded, and airfields handle both combat sorties and evacuation flights. Local authorities and occupation administrations attempt to organize the removal of records, technical personnel and families associated with the garrisons, but capacity is limited. Romanian units, often positioned on flanks or in mountainous terrain, send liaison officers to clarify whether they will be evacuated alongside German formations or expected to hold positions longer to cover the withdrawal. Sevastopol, designated as the final strongpoint, begins to absorb this influx. Command posts are re-established in positions that had been used during the 1941 to 1942 siege, but now bear the marks of earlier destruction and subsequent years of occupation. Coastal batteries and fortress artillery are inspected, with some guns still serviceable and others lacking parts or ammunition. Engineers review pre-war and wartime fortification plans to adapt them to current resources, aware that the city's defensive capacity depends not only on concrete and steel, but also on the number and condition of infantry and artillery units that can reach it from the north. For civilians, along the routes of retreat and advance, the peak of the campaign is marked by rapid transitions. Villages that had seen German and Romanian garrisons for more than 2 years experienced their departure within hours, followed quickly by Soviet reconnaissance patrols and then larger units. Some inhabitants attempt to follow withdrawing troops towards Sevastopol, hoping to secure passage by sea or to stay with familiar authorities. Others remain in place, uncertain about how the return of Soviet power will affect them, especially those who had worked in occupation institutions or had relatives mobilized by the Axis. In Sevastopol itself, the growing presence of retreating units alters daily life. Housing and public buildings are requisitioned for troops and staff. Port facilities are reorganized to handle both incoming supplies and potential evacuation. Shipping is allocated primarily to military needs. Wounded, specialists, and selected personnel are embarked for transport to Romanian or Bulgarian ports, while planning for a wider evacuation remains tentative. The memory of the 1942 evacuation, when many Soviet soldiers and civilians were unable to leave despite prolonged preparations, informs both expectations and fears on all sides, even though the roles are now reversed. On the eastern flank, the separate coastal armies breakout from the Kerch bridgehead develops into a coordinated drive toward the interior. Its rifle corps push westwards, aiming to link with the advancing formations of 4th Ukrainian Front and to cut routes that 17th Army might use to withdraw forces from central Crimea towards Sevastopol. The presence of Soviet forces on multiple axes reduces the options for the defenders to regroup. Rearguard actions around crossroads and river lines consume time and resources, but cannot fully offset the numerical and material advantages that the Soviet side has accumulated for this phase of the campaign. For Soviet commanders and political officers, these days provide material for the narrative of accelerated warfare they wish to project. Reports emphasize that positions lost in 1942 after months of siege are now being approached from the landward side within several days of the initial breakthrough at Perekop and the Sivash. At the same time, the operational diaries record the practical limits of this tempo: fuel shortages, damaged bridges, and the need to rest infantry units that have marched and fought continuously since April 8th. The peak of the campaign is experienced as a combination of rapid advances on maps and a series of demanding marches and engagements on the ground. For the German and Romanian troops of 17th Army, the same period is defined by compressed decisions. Commanders must decide when to abandon intermediate positions and how many men and guns can be sacrificed in rearguard actions to gain time for others to reach Sevastopol. The hope that the fortress might function as a stable defensive zone coexists with awareness of the constraints imposed by limited shipping and declining air support. The choices made in these days determine not only the strength available for the final defense of Sevastopol, but also how many soldiers will eventually become casualties or prisoners during the encirclement that the Soviet command is working to impose. As the front lines contract towards central Crimea, the 17th Army attempts to shift from a linear defense to a system of resistance based on rearguards and temporary strongpoints. Corps and divisional staffs form ad hoc battle groups from depleted infantry battalions, assault gun batteries, and remaining heavy weapons. These groups are assigned to delay Soviet advances at road junctions, river crossings, and ridgelines, then disengage under cover of darkness to rejoin the main body moving towards Sevastopol. Orders emphasize disciplined withdrawal, strict march organization, and the destruction of stockpiles and infrastructure that cannot be evacuated. Romanian units adapt to these conditions in ways that reflect both their training and their position within the Axis command structure. Mountain troops, accustomed to broken terrain, are used to cover flanks in hilly sectors and to hold passages in the approaches to the southern mountains. Romanian infantry divisions, often less well equipped with motor transport, rely more heavily on horse-drawn columns and foot marches. Liaison officers negotiate with German headquarters for fuel, ammunition, and places in road priority schemes, aware that their units risk being cut off if they fall too far behind, or are assigned to hold delaying positions without clear plans for relief. The Luftwaffe and Royal Romanian Air Force adjust their operations as Soviet forces push deeper into the peninsula. Fighter and ground attack units concentrate on interdiction, brief concentrated strikes against Soviet columns, artillery concentrations and bridging sites designed to slow the tempo rather than to eliminate large formations. Pilots operate under growing constraints of fuel and maintenance, and the density of Soviet anti-aircraft fire increases as more guns are brought forward. Despite these limits, even a small number of successful attacks against key bridges or choke points forces Soviet commanders to reroute traffic and allocate more resources to air defense. On the Soviet side, the rapid advance demands continuous adaptation in command and logistics. Tolbukhin's staff refines the roles of forward detachments, assigning combined arms groups with tanks, infantry and engineers to move ahead of the main forces, bypass local resistance and seize crossings intact where possible. Supply services reorganize on the move. Fuel and ammunition dumps are established closer to the front. Local transport is requisitioned, and road control points regulate the flow of units along the constrained network leading to Simferopol and Sevastopol. Commanders revise timetables daily based on road conditions, resistance, and the availability of bridgeheads. Infantry formations adjust their tactics to avoid being fixed by isolated strongpoints. Where rear guards hold villages or prepared positions, Soviet units increasingly seek to envelop, rather than assault frontally, using artillery to pin defenders while maneuver elements move around them. In some cases, commanders leave small blocking detachments to monitor bypassed pockets, expecting them to capitulate when the main front has passed. This approach preserves time and resources, but carries risks if bypassed groups retain enough strength to interfere with supply lines or to delay following echelons. Partisan detachments operating in the Crimean mountains and rural areas enter a new phase of activity as the Red Army approaches. Groups that had focused on sabotage and intelligence gathering now attempt to block roads, cut telephone lines, and attack small Axis detachments moving towards Sevastopol. Some partisan leaders establish contact with advancing Soviet units and offer guides through lesser-known routes, while others remain only loosely coordinated due to communication difficulties and limited radio equipment. For the 17th Army, these actions add another layer of friction to the withdrawal, forcing the allocation of troops to rear security. Within Sevastopol and its approaches, German and Romanian engineers adapt existing fortifications to the current situation. Positions built or reconstructed after 1942 are integrated into a defensive ring that is narrower than the original pre-war perimeter, reflecting reduced troop numbers and the need to economize on artillery and machine gun positions. Old bunkers are inspected and, where possible, rearmed. New trenches and anti-tank ditches are dug to connect strongpoints and cover likely avenues of approach. Coastal defences are recalibrated to support not only resistance to a landward assault, but also the protection of shipping routes that may be needed for large-scale evacuation. Naval commands in Sevastopol, Constanta, and other Black Sea ports adjust their planning to the evolving situation. Warships, merchant vessels, ferries, and smaller craft are organised into convoys to move wounded, specialists, and some combat units to Romanian and Bulgarian ports, while delivering ammunition and supplies on the inbound journeys. Schedules are revised frequently to account for air threats and the changing front line. On the Soviet side, the Black Sea Fleet and air units adapt their own operations, seeking to intercept convoys, mine likely routes and conduct night attacks, all within the constraints imposed by Axis coastal defences and minefields laid earlier in the war. Civilians adapt in ways conditioned by their wartime experience and expectations about the future. Families linked to German and Romanian administration or to local collaborationist structures often attempt to leave with retreating units, moving towards Sevastopol in the hope of securing places on ships. Others choose to remain, calculating that displacement carries its own risks and that front lines can pass quickly. Crimean Tatars, facing widespread suspicion in Soviet planning documents, respond differently depending on locality, family ties, and wartime involvement. Some accompany Axis columns, while others stay in their villages, unaware of the deportation measures being prepared in parallel by Soviet security organs. Among Soviet troops, adaptation takes psychological as well as tactical forms. Political officers and commanders frame the rapid progress as a demonstration of change capabilities since 1942. But company and battalion diaries also record fatigue, shortages, and the impact of continuous marching and fighting. Units that had been rebuilt after earlier Crimean battles now fight over terrain where they or their predecessors had retreated under pressure 2 years earlier. For many, the memory of the prolonged struggle for Sevastopol in 1941 to 1942 coexists with the immediate demands of maintaining the operational tempo that the current offensive requires. For German and Romanian soldiers, resistance and adaptation are expressed in efforts to maintain unit cohesion and discipline under conditions of retreat. Junior commanders organize march groups, salvage weapons and vehicles, and attempt to keep records of personnel amid rapid movements. Some formations manage to reach the Sevastopol perimeter in relatively coherent order, ready to take assigned sectors in the fortress defense. Others arrive fragmented, with reduced combat value, or fail to reach the city at all, absorbed instead into rearguard actions or broken up by encirclements on the steppe roads. The degree to which each unit adapts to these pressures influences how the final defense and evacuation will unfold. The turning point of the Crimean offensive emerges in the second half of April, when the combination of Soviet speed and Axis disorganization produces a structural change in the campaign. After the fall of Jankoy and the breakup of the northern defensive system, Soviet formations advanced towards Simferopol along multiple routes. Forward detachments enter the city on the 13th of April, seizing administrative centers, railway facilities and depots that the 17th Army had hoped to use as staging points for the defense of the Sevastopol approaches. The loss of this hub disrupts remaining plans for a phased retreat and signals that the interior of the peninsula can no longer absorb prolonged delay actions. As Soviet units press on toward Bakhchisarai and the main road to Sevastopol, the defenders increasingly confront a shortage of both time and space. Intermediate positions in the steppe and foothills, marked on German maps as potential stop lines, are occupied only briefly or not at all. Rearguards fight localized engagements, but the pace of the Soviet advance and the pressure on roads from mixed military and civilian traffic make it difficult to assemble new continuous fronts. The contrast with 1941 to 1942 becomes concrete at staff level. Whereas the earlier capture of Sevastopol had followed months of methodical approach and artillery preparation, the Axis garrison now sees the prospect of a Soviet arrival at the outer defences within weeks of the initial breakthrough. In Sevastopol, this shift is registered in daily situation reports. Fortification work continues, but the expected time for organising the defence shrinks as retreating units arrive earlier than planned and in varying states of cohesion. Some divisions reach the city with their artillery and staff structures largely intact. Others bring only partial regiments, mixed detachments, and remnants of support units. Commanders must assign sectors, integrate fragmentary formations into the existing fortress scheme, and decide which positions to prioritize in view of limited manpower and ammunition. The defensive concept evolves from the idea of a layered resistance to a more compressed perimeter designed to hold as long as supplies and morale allow. For Soviet planners, the turning point is expressed in an altered operational timetable. With Simferopol taken and the main road to Sevastopol threatened, headquarters of 4th Ukrainian Front and separate coastal army refine their coordination for the final phase. The front's armies are tasked with closing ring-shaped lines around the city, while the coastal army advances from the east and southeast to cut routes through the mountains and coastal valleys. The goal is to prevent the 17th Army from slipping away by sea in large numbers, and to impose a combined land and air siege that will compress the garrison into a shrinking enclave centered on the port and Cape Chersones. Air and naval operations adjust accordingly. Soviet air units allocate more sorties to ports, anchorages, and coastal roads leading to Sevastopol, attempting to disrupt the flow of supplies and evacuation shipping. Bombers and torpedo aircraft target convoys in the approaches to the city, while reconnaissance flights monitor the concentration of craft in the harbour and off Cape Chersones. The Black Sea Fleet increases mine-laying and coastal bombardment within the limits set by Axis coastal artillery and minefields. For the German and Romanian naval commands, these measures complicate the planning of large-scale evacuation while reinforcing the impression that time available for organised withdrawal is diminishing. Inside the city and on the surrounding heights, the changing balance of time is reflected in the experience of soldiers and civilians. Defensive units dig and reinforce trenches on the Sapun Ridge, in the northern and southern bays, and on the plateau leading to Cape Chersones. Aware that these lines may soon become the last barrier before the sea, civilians observe the arrival of columns from the interior and the increasing congestion at the port, where ships load wounded and selected personnel under air threat. Rumours circulate about possible total evacuation, selective removal of certain categories, or a prolonged stand similar to the earlier siege, but official directives remain focused on continuing resistance. The memory of 1941 to 1942 shapes perceptions on both sides. Soviet troops approaching Sevastopol pass positions where their predecessors had held out under bombardment before being overwhelmed. Political officers and veterans recall the earlier defence in briefings, linking the rapid advance of 1944 to lessons learned about coordination, logistics, and the need to deny the enemy time to build up a methodical siege. For the defenders, the same memory carries a different message. They know how long a determined garrison can hold in prepared positions, but they also recognise that the current situation offers less favourable conditions in terms of supply routes, air cover, and strategic reserves. By late April, this accumulation of factors marks the turning point of the campaign. The 17th Army has been forced back into the Sevastopol area with fewer men and resources than had been available to the Soviet forces in 1941 to 1942, and with a much shorter period in which to adapt the terrain to its needs. The Soviet side, by contrast, has managed to sustain an advance from Perekop and the Sivash to the outer defences of Sevastopol in a span measured in days and weeks rather than months. The stage is set for the final phase, a concentrated assault and siege intended not only to capture the city, but also to prevent the evacuation of a substantial portion of the garrison from the beaches and coves of Cape Chersones. In early May 1944, Sevastopol becomes the focal point of the campaign. After completing the encirclement from land and tightening control of coastal waters, Soviet commands set May 5th as the start date for the final assault. Artillery is massed on the approaches to Sapun Ridge, the northern bays, and the plateau leading to Cape Chersones. For several days, heavy guns and mortars conduct systematic bombardment of identified strongpoints, supply depots and command posts, while air units strike port facilities, anchorages and concentrations of shipping. The intention is to compress the defence into a smaller area and disrupt any organized evacuation plan. German and Romanian units manning the fortress positions attempt to absorb this pressure. Infantry occupy trench systems and bunkers reconstructed or adapted from the earlier siege, while fortress artillery engages Soviet batteries and ships when they come within range. The defensive concept aims to hold the main line on Sapun Ridge and around the northern and southern bays as long as possible, then fall back in stages toward a final perimeter around Cape Chersonis if necessary. Command posts issue orders emphasizing discipline, controlled fire, and the conservation of ammunition, aware that resupply is increasingly constrained by Soviet air and naval activity. On May 7th to 8th, Soviet ground forces begin large-scale assaults. Rifle Corps attack along pre-designated axes, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns wherever the terrain allows. On Sapun Ridge, infantry advance under cover of a dense creeping barrage, using flamethrowers and explosives against bunkers that survived the preliminary bombardment. In the northern sector, units push toward the coastal batteries and observation points that overlook the main harbour. Fighting takes place at short range in ravines, fortifications, and urban outskirts, with both sides drawing on the remaining reserves of morale and material accumulated for this decisive phase. As these assaults take hold, the cohesion of the defence declines. Some strongpoints hold out for hours or days, delaying the attackers and providing cover for withdrawals. But gaps appear as positions are overrun or abandoned. Communication difficulties and losses among officers complicate efforts to coordinate counterattacks. German and Romanian commanders increasingly view Sevastopol not only as a fortress to defend, but also as a departure point. Staff work intensifies on organising evacuation from the port and the beaches and coves of Cape Chersonis, even as formal orders continue to stress resistance. Evacuation efforts reach their peak in these days. Kriegsmarine and Romanian naval vessels, along with requisitioned merchant ships, barges and smaller craft, work to remove wounded specialists and selected combat units. Convoys sail under frequent Soviet air attack and the threat of mines. Priority lists define categories of personnel to be embarked, but implementation is uneven. Local commanders and individual soldiers attempt to secure places through official channels or personal connections. As the Soviet advance compresses the perimeter, roads to Cape Chersonis become congested with mixed columns of troops, staff, equipment and civilians hoping to reach embarkation points. On May 9th, Soviet formations break through remaining organised resistance in the main urban and ridge sectors and enter central Sevastopol. Units secure government buildings, docks and coastal batteries, while isolated pockets continue to fight or withdraw toward Cape Chersonis. The capture of the city centre marks the formal end of organised Axis control over Sevastopol as a fortress, but not the end of the fighting on the peninsula. For several more days, the focus shifts to the narrow strip of land around the Cape, where tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians have converged. Cape Chersonis becomes the scene of a compressed evacuation attempt. Beaches and rocky inlets accommodate improvised embarkation points, with boats ferrying people to larger ships offshore when conditions and enemy fire allow. Soviet artillery and aircraft target the area, striking assembly points and craft near the shore. Command structures struggle to maintain order as the perimeter shrinks. Rearguard units attempt to hold lines long enough for further loading, while fragments of various divisions arrive from inland, adding to the density. Not all ships scheduled or hoped for reach the Cape, and some that do are sunk or damaged en route or during loading. By 12 to 13 May, organised resistance around Cape Chersonis collapses. Soviet units occupy the remaining positions, and the last groups of defenders either surrender or are forced into the sea. Exact figures for those evacuated versus those left behind vary by source, but Soviet reports claim that roughly 110,000 Axis soldiers and personnel were killed or captured during the Crimean offensive. while German and Romanian post-war estimates suggest lower numbers and emphasize those who escaped by sea. In any case, a substantial portion of the 17th Army, including many German and Romanian formations, ceases to exist as a coherent fighting force on the peninsula. Immediately after the end of major combat, Soviet authorities move to secure the area. Military units conduct mopping-up operations, collect weapons and gather prisoners into assembly points for interrogation and transport to camps. Engineering troops begin clearing mines and unexploded ordnance in the city, harbour and surrounding fields, prioritizing key roads, port facilities and airfields. The Black Sea Fleet evaluates the condition of the harbour, docks and coastal batteries, planning repairs that will restore Sevastopol's role as a major base for naval operations in the western Black Sea. For civilians, the immediate aftermath brings both relief from bombardment and the onset of new controls. Residents who stayed in the city and villages emerge from shelters to find extensive damage to housing, infrastructure and industrial facilities. Soviet military and security organs re-establish administrative structures, register inhabitants, and investigate alleged collaboration. Food, fuel, and medical supplies remain scarce, and reconstruction begins under conditions of tight rationing. Refugees and those who had fled with Axis forces but failed to leave by sea face decisions about returning to their homes or resettling elsewhere under Soviet oversight. In the broader operational context, the conclusion of the Crimean offensive frees the 4th Ukrainian Front and the separate coastal army for redeployment. Formations that have taken Sevastopol are earmarked for future operations toward Romania and the Balkans, where control over the western Black Sea coastline and ports will play a role in subsequent campaigns. For the Axis, the loss of Crimea and Sevastopol reduces their ability to threaten Soviet shipping in the Black Sea and removes a forward base that had supported operations toward the Caucasus. The evacuation from Cape Chersones, conducted under pressure and with partial success, becomes an example of the difficulties of extracting large forces once the balance of time and control over air and sea routes has shifted. In the years that follow, the Crimean offensive of April-May 1944 is remembered in different ways by the societies and institutions involved. In Soviet accounts, the campaign is presented as a demonstration of matured operational art, a coordinated assault by 4th Ukrainian Front and the separate coastal army that recaptured the peninsula in about 1 month of active operations, from the breakthrough at Perekop and the Sivash on 8th to 11th April to the fall of Sevastopol on 9th May. The contrast with the 250-day German siege of 1941 to 1942 becomes a central narrative device. Where the Axis had required months of methodical preparation and attrition to force Sevastopol's defences, the Red Army in 1944 is shown advancing from the northern isthmuses to the city's outskirts in days and clearing the fortress in weeks. Soviet military historians link this tempo to institutional changes since 1941. Improved coordination between fronts, greater concentration of artillery, better integration of air power and ground operations, and more effective logistics. The destruction or capture of a large part of the 17th Army, often summarized in figures of approximately 110,000 Axis casualties and prisoners, is used as evidence that the Red Army can not only repel offensives, but also conduct encirclement operations on complex terrain. Sevastopol's recapture on May 9, 1944, 1 year before the German capitulation in Europe, is incorporated into calendars, medals and commemorations, reinforcing the city's status as a symbol of endurance and regained control over the Black Sea. German and Romanian post-war narratives emphasize different aspects. Memoirs by officers of 17th Army and the naval commands tend to stress the constraints under which they operated. The loss of the land corridor, dependence on vulnerable sea lines of communication, limited air support, and the impact of orders to hold Crimea as a fortress even after the strategic situation had changed. The evacuation from Sevastopol and Cape Chersonis is analysed as a partial success and a partial failure. Tens of thousands of personnel are estimated to have escaped by sea, but many formations are broken up or destroyed during the retreat and final encirclement. For these authors, the campaign illustrates the consequences of delaying evacuation decisions until the attacker has already seized the initiative and control of air and sea approaches. In Romanian historiography, the focus often falls on the fate of Romanian mountain and infantry divisions that fought in Crimea from 1941 onward. The losses incurred in the 1944 withdrawal and at Sevastopol contribute to broader reassessments of Romania's alliance with Germany and the costs of participation on the Eastern Front. After Romania's shift of allegiance in August 1944, official narratives change, and the Crimean campaign is later presented as part of a sequence of events that weakened the Romanian army before it fought alongside the Allies in the final year of the war. For civilians and local communities, the legacy of the operation is inseparable from its immediate aftermath. The recapture of Crimea is followed on May 18th to 20th, 1944, by the mass deportation of Crimean Tatars, and later of other groups accused by Soviet security organs of collective disloyalty. Entire villages are emptied and populations transported to Central Asia and other regions. In this sense, the end of German and Romanian occupation is accompanied by a new wave of displacement imposed by Soviet authorities. For Russian, Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar communities, these events shape long-term memory in different directions, as liberation and restoration of Soviet sovereignty, as another episode of war and repression, or as the starting point of exile. The strategic consequences of the offensive extend beyond the peninsula. With Crimea and Sevastopol back under Soviet control, the Black Sea Fleet gains a secure base for operations against Axis coastal shipping and ports. German and Romanian forces lose a platform from which they had supported earlier actions toward the Caucasus and threatened Soviet sea routes. The elimination of the 17th Army simplifies the Red Army's southern front as it moves toward operations in Romania, Bulgaria, and the Balkans later in 1944, contributing to the breakdown of Axis defences along the lower Danube and in the Carpathian region. Over time, the campaign becomes a case study in comparative analysis. Military historians examine the 1941 to 1942 and 1944 battles for Sevastopol side by side, noting that the same terrain and many of the same fortifications supported very different outcomes. They point to changes in force ratios, artillery density, air strength, supply capacity, and command decisions. Some studies highlight the impact of Hitler's insistence on holding Crimea, arguing that a timely evacuation could have saved formations for later battles. Others emphasize that relinquishing the peninsula earlier would have carried its own strategic risks for Axis control of the Black Sea and Romanian oil. Commemoration practices reflect these layered interpretations. In Soviet and later Russian traditions, monuments, museums, and annual ceremonies in Sevastopol emphasize the continuous line between the defense of 1941 to 1942 and the liberation of 1944, presenting them as chapters of a single story of resilience and eventual return. Ukrainian perspectives, especially after 1991, incorporate the Crimean offensive into a broader narrative of the Second World War on Ukrainian territory, paying greater attention to local experiences and to the deportations. Crimean Tatar communities mark 1944 primarily through remembrance of exile, for whom the offensive and its outcome are inseparable from the loss of homeland. From an analytical standpoint, the Crimean offensive of 1944 can be seen as an operation where tempo, geography, and political decisions intersected. The Soviet command used concentrated force and coordinated axes of advance from Perekop, the Sivash and the Kerch bridgehead, to compress what had previously been a prolonged siege into a short campaign. The German and Romanian commands, constrained by orders to hold and by material limits, attempted to trade space for time but were unable to prevent encirclement and large-scale capture. The evacuation at Cape Chersonis, carried out under continuous pressure, became a visible marker of that imbalance. The long-term significance of these events lies not only in territorial control, but also in how they shaped perceptions of military capability and state authority. For the Soviet Union, the rapid recapture of Crimea and Sevastopol supported claims that the Red Army had transformed since the early years of the war and that past defeats could be reversed through planning, industrial output and mobilization. For the Axis, the loss of the peninsula underscored the shrinking strategic space available by mid-1944. For the diverse populations of Crimea, the conclusion of the campaign marked the end of one occupation, the beginning of renewed Soviet rule, and a set of demographic and political changes that would influence the region's history long after the last gunfire around Cape Chersonis had ceased.